Welcome to the Forest Practices Board webinar, Reforestation in the Dry Interior Douglas-Fir Subzone. For those of you who don't know the board, we are the public's independent watchdog for sound forest and range practices in BC. We've been around since 1995, and we conduct independent audits and investigations of compliance with the Forest and Range Practices, reporting our findings to the public. One of our main programs is Special Investigations, where we examine regional or provincial forest and range practice issues of importance to the public. This special investigation looked at reforestation success in the dry fir subzone in the interior of BC. Our intent was to see how well reforestation is working in these difficult sites and to identify any needed improvements to legislation, policy, and practice. I will be moderating today's event. My name is Sky, and I'm the Executive Operations Coordinator for the Forest Practices Board. I'm hosting this webinar from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. As a guest, I recognize the importance of their historical relationship with the land that continues to this day. In a moment, I will introduce you to our panelists. First, I would like to briefly run through the flow of today's webinar. The format for today's event will be about a half-hour presentation, followed by a question and answer opportunity. Keep an eye out also for a couple of audience participation polls that we will launch throughout the presentation. Questions for our question and answer portion today will be gathered from you, our audience, using a thought exchange platform. I've just displayed the QR code and the web address to take you to the exchange. This is the same exchange that was shared with you in our invitation to register. So if you have already participated, your questions are recorded within this same exchange. To participate now, if you have a smart device on hand, open the camera and focus on that QR code, and it will take you right into the exchange. Alternately, you can enter the web address into your browser, tejoin.com, and then enter that 9-digit ID that you see on screen when you're prompted. It will take you to the same exchange. Once there, you will see our conversation prompt asking you to pose your questions. Your questions remain anonymous, as do your rankings of other folks' questions. When you're done entering your questions, you'll be given the opportunity to rate those questions of your fellow attendees on a scale of 1 to 5 stars. Doing this will help me direct our panelists to those questions of greatest importance to you. You may choose to keep it open in the background during the presentation so that you can continue to pose questions and rate the questions posed by others. I will display this QR code and web address once more during today's presentation. Attendees, you have all entered this webinar in listen-only mode. This means you are muted and the speakers cannot hear you. As the webinar ends today, you will see a brief survey that we would appreciate your feedback on. Let's get started with reforestation in the dry interior Douglas-Fir subzone. Your presenters today are Daryl Spencer, a registered professional forester with the Forest Practices Board. He's working on the Silesian territory in Kelowna, and Ken Day, RPF, broadcasting from the territory of the Northern Secwepemc and Williams Lake First Nations. Later in today's presentation, we'll be joined by guest speaker Neil Hughes, an RPF with the Resource Practices Branch. Like me, Neil is on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. Daryl, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Sky, and welcome everyone to our webinar on reforestation in the dry IDF. Our topics today will be, I'll be covering a brief investigation summary of what we found, and Ken and I will discuss and present some standard management practices we observed in the field, and Ken will have a demonstration on thinking critically about shelter in the IDF. I will briefly summarize the investigation recommendations, and that will lead to Neil, who will discuss ministry guidance and resources currently available and being worked on by the ministry. So let's get into it. So we did our special investigation that spread from 2018 to 2020, and as a result of the investigation, the board sees a need for refining silviculture practices in the dry IDF ecosystems in BC to help improve meeting management and timber, or help improve management and achieving timber resource objectives there. Why did we undertake this special investigation? We felt it was timely due to recent focus on harvesting in the dry belt. Forest health issues are emerging, such as fire management, insects, disease, that require focus on effective reforestation strategies to manage those. And there's more implications or further implications in climate change. So what did we look at? We looked at 4 case study districts: the Caribou-Chilcotin, the Cascades, the Okanagan-Shuswap, and the Thompson Rivers districts. And we examined in those districts pre and post-harvest tree species composition and looked at compliance with FERPA, effectiveness of reforestation choices, and the effectiveness of government direction. This presentation will focus on the first 2 primarily. Ken and I spent, and Ken Zelke as well, spent up to 5 days in each district reviewing practices in the field. If you require more details on what we did and how we looked at it, those are provided in the report. There's another item I want to mention at this time, that our sampling was focused on stands that were best suited to us to test for species resilience. So what species are out there that will rebound from potential disturbance and kind of bounce back and keep growing into the future. So we focused on areas where there are species conversions, primarily to lodgepole pine, and stands with high pine components. Now to put this into context, within the 4 districts over the investigation period, there were 60,000 hectares harvested in the dry IDF. And the areas with species conversions and high pine component were about 1/3 of that area, so 20,000 hectares. So our results really speak to those areas, and there's other areas there. The other 70% of the areas we didn't look at, we don't speak to those, and the management and condition of those stands may be altogether different. So we're focusing on the more marginal areas just to try and find where the challenges might lie. So getting into compliance, we found that compliance is great, mostly almost 100% compliance overall. It was a job well done in being compliant with legislation. What we did find was just a block or 2 with annual reporting was late, and where stocking standards weren't quite met at the late regen delay period, and that was because of 2017 drought. And there was 1 block that was in mule deer winter range that didn't quite meet the fur component when we looked at it, but still has several years to go before free growing, so it may or may not make it depending on how regeneration proceeds from here. At this time, I'll pass it off to Sky, and we have a polling question. Sky?
Thanks, Daryl. Audience, this is your opportunity to participate. Daryl is asking you your opinion on the statement. The current legislative framework promotes good silviculture practices in the IDF. Grab your mouse and click on your response, or participate on your touchscreen devices. Polls like these are quick opportunities for our panelists to gain insight about our live participants. I can already see your results rolling in. I'll close this in just another moment, and I'll share the results with the group before we move on. Thanks very much for your participation. Here's how our results read. We've got about a 38% of disagree. 1/3 of our audience is neutral on that, with another spattering at agree and strongly disagree. I'm going to send that back to you, Daryl.
Great, thanks, Sky. Interesting results. It's hopefully, I'm sure what we go through subsequently in this presentation will shed some light on that as well. So further into the investigation, we looked at species selection over the term of the investigation and found that, well, first of all, I'll explain this graph, and that we looked at species conversions, and favorable was viewed as species conversions to more resilient species, and unfavorable was converting to lodgepole pine stands, which is the orange in the bars there. So generally overall, we didn't really have enough. The results were somewhat inconsistent, but generally overall, we found that species conversions to pine happen less frequently in the latter part, say the last 5 years of the investigation period. And licensees tended to plant more mixed species stands in all districts within the past 5 years. So definitely a thought, our perspective change to mixed species. How did that affect stand condition? Well, as you can see here, we've got the poor, marginal, and good stand conditions. And this is stand condition with the perspective of how likely is the stand to get to free growing and meet subsequent resource objectives beyond there. So we found that lodgepole pine leading stands were slightly in poorer condition, but that wasn't the only determining factor. We also had several other stand condition factors and elements we looked at to determine stand condition, and species composition was minor, played a more minor role in relation to the other factors, which I will get into in the next slide. So stand condition factor summary. Now these factors were assessed in consideration of how they may affect free-going obligations and meeting long-term objectives. So we had health, any health issues that were emerging or present in the stand that may be problematic to getting to free growing, competing vegetation as well in terms of establishing seedlings and the productivity or the growth of seedlings to free growing, site treatments, whether site treatments were applied where they could have been, and the timeliness of site treatments, retention levels, what was retained in the blocks versus what was available, and was there opportunity to retain more and different distributions of retention. Stocking, how was stocking managed? Was it managed to minimums, or were increased stocking levels used in situations where it might help account for or accommodate for expected mortality and species composition? Were ecologically suitable species planted on site or regenerated on site, and were they applied in the right places on a cut block, for example? So overall, the main factors, there's some variability within districts, but overall, the investigation found that the three main factors contributing to poorer stand condition were health, competing vegetation, and stocking management. Site treatments to a lesser degree, and then retention levels and species composition at 14 and 17% to the least degree. Another thing to consider is climate change and species migration. The yellow on this image is the IDF, and UBC and other organizations, my predictions were taken from UBC trials, but have predicted into the future that there will be a 91% in the increase in area of the IDF and an increased distribution throughout the province. So this emphasizes the need to develop strategies now with the potential that these areas may increase in the future and require the same diligence or degree of management. The concerns with climate change is that it creates additional uncertainties for managing incremental drought, heat, species migration, and emerging forest health concerns associated with ecological shifting. There may be potentially new or novel forest health problems emerging, and for current management, hotter and drier summers may mean more frequent and longer duration of moisture and heat stress, and emphasize the importance of developing effective silviculture regimes to address those extremes. Okay, over to you, Sky.
Thanks, Daryl. We will continue with more from Daryl and bring in Ken in just a moment. Right now, I would like to remind you of our ongoing thought exchange. We've just displayed that QR code and web address again to take you to the exchange. And just in case you miss it, in the chat function down below, Darlene has also shared that for you, so it'll be available after this slide is no longer on screen. As a reminder, this is what we're using to gather questions from the audience, and our panelists get to address those questions at the end of the presentation. Your questions remain anonymous, as do your rankings of others' questions. For those that just arrived or arrived late and missed my earlier instructions, if you have a smart device at hand, just open that up and focus on the QR code, and it will take you right into the exchange. Alternately, you can type in the web address displayed, tejoin.com, into your browser and enter the 9-digit ID when you're prompted. You may choose to keep it open in the background during the remainder of the presentation so that you can continue to pose questions and rate the questions posed by others. One last reminder as I send you back to Daryl and Ken, as this webinar ends today, you'll see a brief survey that we would appreciate your feedback on. If you missed that survey today, you'll get a chance to access it through the follow-up email you'll receive in the next few days. Let's move on to stand management and site planning, Daryl.
Yes, so this is next section of the presentation where we go into stand management aspects related to the stand condition elements that were mentioned earlier and what our observations were in the field and through our planning review. So I will cover the planning elements, and then Ken will take over and cover the site elements from there. So quite often we observe site plans that were less detailed and broad and didn't account for the complexity that may be experienced in the dry IDF ecosystems. Dry IDF ecosystems to be effective in their planning may require more stratification and site series based practices and ensuring that adequate training is conducted to do the work at all phases of the operations, from planning to harvest to silviculture. So briefly, I'll just say, to emphasize the detail, I'll go through these various elements that I have taken from a site plan. So to start out with, get all the detailed information you need on your site to make choices in what your practices might be from there. So know your silvics, know your current stand structure, know what stand structure is available there to utilize for your silviculture regimes. Know your ecology and site limiting factors, where there might be problematic or critical areas that you need to address. Know your health, what forest health agents are there, insects, diseases, root rots, rusts, and so forth, and how those need to be managed for, and what species you need to choose to help manage for those forest health agents. Know your resource objectives. Is there overriding objectives such as mule deer winter range that require certain stand structures and species requirements? So once that's all gathered, formulate a detailed harvest treatment. And I'd like to emphasize that harvest treatment should be connected with your silviculture treatments, so that when your detailed silviculture treatments are developed, the opportunity to implement those treatments has not been detrimentally affected by harvesting activities. So overall, prescribing foresters should be aware of planning complexity and who will be carrying out the work. Implementing foresters should understand the risks of changing the prescription at harvest time and ensure that qualified people are employed to make changes. And that's it for my section for now, and I'd like to pass it over to Ken for more stand management observations. Ken.
Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity to present to you this morning. And I'm going to jump in where Daryl left off, from the paperwork into the actual implementation, and discuss with you some of what we saw in the field. So first of all, silvicultural systems. Admittedly, in the study period, the dominant harvest activity was focused around mountain pine beetle salvage. And so our opportunity to find selection harvest blocks was quite limited. We found 4 blocks in our pool that were selection system blocks. 65 blocks were clear cut with reserves. There's no clear distinction between the stand conditions, thinking clear cut versus selection, given the number of selection blocks we had available. The main contributing factors for poor selection system condition were low stocking in the overstory, resulting in significant grass competition, and a lack of site preparation, resulting in low stocking in the regeneration layer. Now remember, in selection system blocks, the stand remains stocked in overstory, so we don't expect regeneration on every square meter of the harvest area. Clear-cut systems had a broader range of factors contributing to their poor stand condition, and many of those related to shelter, and we'll talk more about shelter as we go on. In terms of health of the stands we observed, the photos give you an indication of the primary forest health issues we encountered. Drought and heat stress, particularly in 2017 field season, we had a lot of, 2018, we had a lot of drought and heat stress from the 2017 growing season. Growing season frost was a frequent problem observed on Douglas-Fir and to some extent on spruce, and cattle damage was frequently noted. There were a wide range of other forest health agents noted in our survey work. Tip weevils on both pine and spruce, root collar weevil on pine, root disease, armillaria and phalinus both. We noted stem rusts and elytroderma needle disease and needle casts in lodgepole pine. The primary problem we noted in terms of competing vegetation was by far and away grass management. Mountain pine, pine grass, well established at the time of planting or even before harvest, created significant problems, and where we did not have site preparation, we saw significant stocking problems. The delay between disturbance and regeneration contributes to that, because while you're waiting, the pine grass is able to establish more effectively and putting the regeneration behind. Pine grass was particularly serious where we were in salvage mode, and there were perhaps up to 5 years difference between the time of the pine stand, in particular the stand dying, and the salvage harvest. So in that intervening time between mortality and harvest, the pine grass was able to establish very effective, very dense communities under the dead pine, and harvest disturbance was not sufficient to impact that pine community, that pine grass community, excuse me. In terms of site treatments, we saw site preparation was quite common. Where there was no site preparation, we saw, as I said, significant problems with survival and performance. I'll just step through some photos. We saw lots of disc drenching. That seemed to be the dominant site preparation treatment. We saw many examples where landing piles and roadside piles had been burned, and there was good planting survivorship in the burn piles with poor survivorship in the adjacent untreated pine grass. That indicates to me, at least, that burning may be a significant opportunity that we haven't pursued. We saw examples of coarse woody debris retention, where the coarse woody debris is intended to mitigate the impacts of solar radiation and frost, but also creating obstacles for cows to step over and reducing cattle damage. And that's probably the primary objective in coarse woody debris retention, is to reduce cattle damage. We saw examples of hose griefing to reduce vegetation competition. and stumping to manage root disease inoculum on site. And we saw one example of deep ripping post-fire, working to establish Douglas-Fir in a mule deer winter range in those ripped trenches. Our observations around retention showed us that that there was a significant amount of mature retention. In many cases, the amount of retention was determined based on fairly well, based on objectives handed down from government around levels of retention. And so most of the retention tended to be large trees that were bigger than the merchantability limits or bigger than the utilization limits in the sawmill. Where we saw uniform retention or more frequent retention, we saw improvement in survival and in growth. We also saw strategies around mixed species, Douglas-Fir and pine established, and spruce established under aspen, and also mixed species where we had, say, larch or lodgepole pine planted at the same time as Douglas-Fir and spruce to create a nurse crop effect in those situations. In terms of stocking rates, we saw a need for higher planting density. The photograph in the bottom left of the screen is showing you lodgepole pine stand on target density and at over 2 meters in height, still green to the ground, green branches to the ground. The quality that will result from those densities is suspect in my mind, the log quality. And in addition, there's not much buffer for the early stand mortality that we need to expect with lodgepole pine. So we certainly wanted to emphasize the importance of higher planting densities and give a nod to the enhanced stocking standards that government and industry together are producing throughout the region we surveyed. In terms of species selection, we wanted to emphasize the importance of getting the right species on the right site. We certainly need to think about species migration in the face of climate change, and the ministry is developing tools that Neil will talk about in that regard. I think personally, we need to be thoughtful about stand development and succession. What are the stand dynamics in the mixtures of species we're installing? And is it appropriate that we are growing intimate mixtures, or do we need to actually be stratifying our mixtures so that we put, for example, the spruce on the low ground and the Douglas-Fir on the high cold air shedding ground and the lodgepole pine on mesic areas? I think that kind of stratified mixture is likely to be more successful than the situation where we plant lodgepole pine and Douglas-Fir in intimate mixtures. The lodgepole pine assumes a dominant position and has taken on effectively a much lower stand density because it's growing above the competition of the Douglas-Fir. So with that, I'll take a brief pause and pass it over to Skye for another polling question.
Audience, once again, you have the opportunity to participate in real time. This time, Ken asks you, is government direction and practice likely to result in appropriate species mixtures? Once again, grab your mouse and click on your response or participate on your touchscreen devices. I'll pause for just a few moments while you select your answers. And here we have, looks like most of our audience members, Ken, are saying somewhat likely to that question. Is government direction and practice likely to result in appropriate species mixes? Back to you, Ken.
Okay, thank you for that. So thanks for your input, folks. And I think that there's an opportunity for more discussion as we go forward with enhanced stocking standards and our objective to diversify species on the landscape and at the cut block level. Thank you for your input. Now, those of you that have known me for any time know that I'm a proponent for leaving some residuals behind. And that's because I've spent my career thinking about shelter and the importance of shelter in regeneration, success, and performance, survival and performance. So I'd like to take a few minutes and talk with you about thinking critically about shelter and provide some rationale for why I believe we need to do a better job around shelter and incorporate it in all our prescriptions in the IDF. So here we are. This schematic is showing you the situation at noon on the summer solstice on the 50th parallel. So somewhere between Kelowna and Penticton. We select the right spot, we wait until noon, and we look up and we see that the sun angle is at 61 degrees. That's the maximum sun angle for the year. The sun is pouring radiation heat down onto the Earth's surface, and whatever surface it strikes depends on slope and aspect. With the intensity it strikes at depends on slope and aspect. So this green-shaped dish at the bottom of the slide is intended to be a cross-section of the Earth's surface with a north aspect on the left-hand side and a south aspect on the right-hand side. We plant seedlings or grow seedlings anywhere in this dish. The seedlings just have to stand there and take it on the chin as the sun pours in on them. So to think this through more critically, I went into an old textbook. It's called The Climate Near the Ground by Geiger in 1965. And I carved this graphic out of that book and colored it up to give it a heat ramp. And what it's showing you is a heat map with the same slope and aspect as the cross section below. So south aspect 90 degrees on the immediate right-hand side of the screen, and north aspect 90-degree slope on the left side of the screen. You can see that the maximum solar input at that time throughout the day on June 21st is 80 calories per square centimeter per hour. So that little bullseye target right there, and that's approximately, or I suppose it's exactly where the sun angle is striking the ground at perpendicular. 80 calories per square centimeter per hour. That heat's arriving at the ground surface. Okay, and as I say, the seedlings are just standing there taking it on the chin. If we put on that cross section limits that reflect the operational ground we manage in the IDF, primarily we're up to 35% slope. And that operational ground then from 10 to 16, or from 10 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that operable ground is receiving between 50 and 80 calories per square centimeter per hour, depending on its slope and aspect. Okay, so now I said we're standing on the 50th parallel, and this heat map is the same anywhere on the 50th parallel. Doesn't matter whether you're between Kelowna and Penticton or somewhere north of Vancouver. Doesn't matter. It's the same everywhere. So why is it particularly important in the IDF? Well, let's understand what the thermal dynamics are on the site. First of all, surface temperatures greater than 50 degrees are lethal to tender to unprotected tissues. Surface air held, within that 2 centimeter range of the soil surface is held very tightly to the ground by friction. So the heat's not dissipated by convection, where you might expect that, as is typical up around your face, the heat that's arriving on you is convected away. So that's not working near the ground because that heat is held so tightly by friction. So the primary heat transfer mechanism is by conduction of that heat into the soil. Remember, forest floors have poor heat conduction. They're kind of an insulating blanket, but in the IDF, typically forest floor is quite thin. Water obviously has good heat conducting properties, but dry sites have very little soil moisture, and therefore dry soils conduct heat poorly. So the heat at the soil surface is not conducted to greater depth effectively. Again, our seedlings are just standing there trying to survive in 50 degrees centigrade, Celsius, excuse me. And you know what that feels like when you're standing out in the sun at 40 degrees. So that's the situation we consign our seedlings to without shelter. Smith et al. In their silviculture textbook said shading is the most important physical process subject to silvicultural manipulation. So if we leave a few trees, some number of trees on the site to intercept the sun, it reduces the heat accumulation at the ground surface by dappled shade moving across the site as the sun moves through its daily and seasonal arc. So the seedlings that are gasping for cool air down in this hot stretch are going to get a little bit of relief as the sun moves behind the next tree crown. They get some sun to do what they need to do, and they get some relief from the heat. Obviously, complete shade all day long is not what we're looking for. We don't want to grow our seedlings in a cupboard. We need moving sunflex, so the sun gets to every portion of the regeneration. Now, the same principles are active at night, but kind of in an opposite way. So shelter at night interrupts the radiation. Radiation is the heat leaving the surfaces that have stored heat through the day. It goes on all the time, but the balance of radiation out exceeds radiation in overnight, obviously, when the sun has set. Those same surfaces are going to send their heat away out into deep sky unless there's some kind of a layer intercepting the radiation, and that's why cloudy nights are warmer than clear nights. So now the conduction of heat, well, excuse me, when heat leaves the site by radiation, it causes that surface to chill. That cold surface now chills the air around it. And cold air, as we know, is heavier than warm air, and therefore moves downslope to accumulate behind barriers or in low-lying places. This problem is interrupted where conduction can replace the heat at the soil surface from lower in the soil profile. So heat can move out of the soil to the surface that's been chilled and replace that heat before cold air accumulates much. But again, we're talking about dry sites with little soil moisture, and therefore they can't replace that heat lost to space. If we interpose some overhead shelter, those same two schematic trees there, those trees canopies will intercept the heat and bounce it back to the soil surface, warming the surfaces again and reducing the chilling impact. With that, I will pass it back to Daryl to move us forward. Thank you.
Okay, Ken, thanks for that. It was very informative. I'll just briefly summarize our recommendations resulting from the investigation. So we made 2 recommendations to government. One was to reassess the long-term objectives for the dry IDF and consider climate change and adapting to climate change in regards to those objectives, and update reforestation standards and guidance. In terms of objectives, I should consider a range of objectives for forest resources out there and what's becoming appropriate with climate change, and consider from a forestry perspective is where we should be trying to grow trees on dry IDF sites. Reforestation standards and guidance to help licensees manage dry IDF stands effectively. To see whether the government can refine or develop good legal direction on what choices are the range of choices, such as stocking standards, changing some of those for species and stocking levels and so forth, for provide more choices for licensees to manage their stands, and more guidance such as best management practices and so forth to provide some guidance to licensees. There are other things, and perhaps in line with the objectives is to tie tactical planning and so forth into broader level strategic objectives into more management unit or TSA type objectives to tie together the objectives at the various levels. And this is be a segue into now what Neil is going to talk about, and he will I'll pass it on to him next, and he'll provide a brief summary of guidance or other resources the ministry currently has or is developing. So Neil, over to you, and just tell me when you want your slides changed.
Sure. Thank you very much, Daryl and Ken. That was excellent. I felt like I was back at school there for a while listening to Ken. My name is Neil Hughes, and I say I'm work for Resource Practices Branch, and I'm responsible for helping to coordinate the ministry's response to the board report. And so I think I think you've heard a lot today of that report and what's gone into it. And I don't need to say really that over the last 20, 30 years, there's actually been a lot of research gone into silviculture in the dry IDF area. And as well as research, a lot of focus on developing silviculture strategies to make that happen in practice. And so as a result of that, some of the recent updates to policy standards and silviculture requirements that you should be able to find out there would be amended species choices and stocking standards. Ongoing work over the last 5 years has resulted in some of that. Again, work such as that of Teresa Newsom's around the amount of deciduous competition affecting stands is very, very important and has been brought into practice. The use of enhanced stocking standards, both for lodgepole pine and for Douglas-Fir. You heard Ken Day mention the importance of increasing initial densities at establishment. That is now reflected through the opportunity to use enhanced standards. And then also, really importantly, I think some of the links to climate change and the fact that the ministry and the province is probably a leader in the recognition of climate change and considering ways to link our understanding through research to practices. So we have now climate-based seed transfer, which is a requirement to enable us to consider using different seed, which we feel will be more climatically suited to conditions in future decades. And the initial introduction and thought around species selection using a tool that's being developed, climate change informed species selection as a concept and a tool, again, to help us try and understand as climate envelopes change, how do we change our species selection to ensure that our choices are climatically these are actions that are in place right now. The third one that I want to mention in terms of silviculture that's really important around the training and guidance piece, and again, that's been brought up today a couple of times. I'll take you back to, I think, March 2017, and the region, Caribou Region and Resource Practices Branch put on a workshop in Williams Lake on reforestation practices in the IDF. I think there was over 130 people attended. Back in the day, we could have face-to-face meetings. And out of that came a call for actually more focused guidance in the form of some best management practices. And although, of course, the 2017 fires, 2018 fires have interfered with a lot of ongoing work, we are happy to be able to say that we now have a complete and finalized best management practices for establishing dry sites in the Thompson Okanagan region, which will be available soon. And we're ongoing with a similar set of practices for establishing fir on dry sites in the Caribou region. That should be available finished next year. So more to come on those in the future. So as well as actual silviculture and silviculture practices, if you could move to the next slide, actually, please, Daryl. Thank you. The silviculture practices alone, we are also at the same time doing a lot of work at the ecosystem level and in developing new management direction. So much of this work revolves around adaptive management and resiliency. And again, Ken has specifically focused there on some of the aspects around species choice and silviculture systems that point towards resiliency. So our understanding, most importantly, of how all the other non-timber resources interact and influence each other, and most importantly, influence our management decisions for this ecosystem. And so to sort of sum this all up, there's a number of initiatives going on in the two regions that cover most of the IDF, the Thompson Okanagan and the Caribou, which are hoping to pull this together through a new management framework, which will prioritize forest resilience and take a broad approach to balancing the multiple resource values in this ecosystem. And of course, this will happen through a range of legislation, policy, standards, and as I've already mentioned, best management practices. So some of this is short term and will be available very soon. As I say, we hope to be holding our own webinars very soon, if not in person, around, as I say, best management practices. We'll go into greater detail. And then some of it will be unfolding over the next 12 months in terms of legislation policy around our management decisions for the region. So with that, back to you, Daryl.
Thanks for that, Neil. I'm going to take us on to a slide that'll show everybody what our social media handles are. And if you have any questions after the end of this webinar, there's some contact information for Daryl there. I'm going to bring in Daryl and Ken as I prepare for our exchange of our questions that you have been posing. I'm just taking a look at our time here, and I see that we're running pretty late, and I do want to spend some time with those questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow this webinar to run late so that we can cover more questions rather than cutting it off directly at 11 o'clock. So if you have more to share, please do. Actually, I've closed that thought exchange for now, but if you do have an interest in hearing more of the questions and answers, then stick around for that. I'm just going to make sure I've covered off all of the information I wanted to before sharing. Great, I have. On to sharing our first question. Microsite forestry practices started in the 80s. Shelter concepts have been known by foresters for decades. Why is this not common practice now? Reforestation success should be paramount. Daryl and Ken.
You want that one, Ken, or should I?
Sure, I'll start, join in. I think the simplest answer is that while these techniques or issues have been taught for many years, in British Columbia, we have had 2 decades of lodgepole pine salvage that has taken us to clear-cut practices. And so why isn't it common practice now? We're on the transition back to the IDF. The harvest in the IDF has been strongly focused on pine beetle salvage, and furthermore, the harvesting techniques have migrated to systems that are tailored for clear cutting. So as I've said elsewhere, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you've got roadside logging as a harvest method in your contracting workforce, then it's going to be clear cut.
Anything to add, Daryl?
I think I concur with Ken and what he said, and also I might add that just the planning concepts and the training and the knowledge base of prescribing foresters may not. There's been a big gap, like Ken says, 20 years since practicing in green stands and so forth, addressing salvage over years. So there's boilerplates or the salvage mentality or approach being used in some of the planning that precludes microsite management.
Thanks very much. I'll move us on to our next question. Site preparation is a major issue. What can be done? Is broadcast burning a viable option?
I think broadcast burning certainly is a viable option. We're working hard. Folks are working hard to develop opportunities for broadcast burning as a fuel treatment and as a traditional practice. And I think there's an opportunity. It's my own opinion. There's an opportunity to take that more broadly into our practices, both for risk reduction and for site preparation for regeneration.
Yeah, I think that burning certainly is viable out there. We did see some good success with some of the burned areas in terms of survival and establishment. Another item we noticed out there was just the timing. It's not necessarily the application of site preparation, but the timing of the site preparation. And it was done too far after the harvest or disturbance activity to effectively capture the moisture windows needed to help successor regeneration and control invasive grasses and so forth.
Thank you. Our next question, how well does the distribution of silviculture systems in the sample represent the population? For example, clear cuts were 94% of the sample. Is it representative? It seems stand retention can be improved in clear cut harvests. It is important to understand how representative this issue is.
There was more selection harvests that took place out there than what we looked at. Remember, our criteria was to bias a sample to look at species resilience at the beginning. So there is quite a bit of stands that were included. We focused on high pine and species conversion stands. And so representation, we looked at 30% of the total area harvested within those within the investigation period. So our observations only apply to that area, and there is success stories and more selection harvest that is going on, and we didn't find those to be or expect those to be too problematic, although we did find that there was a lack of focus on the regeneration layer in the harvest selection harvest we looked at. So maybe something to consider in the future is just that regeneration layer and how that's established.
Thanks very much. Before I move us on to our next question, I'm just going to let our audience know that at this point we're running a little bit beyond our time. When you receive your exit poll, either at the end of this webinar when you leave or when you receive your follow-up email, one of the questions in that exit poll is if you would be interested in a follow-up recording of us answering more questions. So if you are, please click yes on that, and we'll consider that in deciding if we want to do another follow-up. I'm going to move us on to our next question now. Site plan. Detailed recognition of the reforestation risks and requirements should be mandatory and the signing RPF accountable. Reduce the risk of not meeting reforestation commitments. Anything to say on that?
No, I agree with it. And there are different ways to approach how to manage stands at the site level. One is to provide detailed recognition, and where that recognition occurs might be in the plan, or it might be in the practitioners that are implementing a plan. So if there's not detailed recognition, our qualified people out there making the right choices on the ground. So there's got to be a balance attained one way or the other, detailed recognition, and yes, the RPF should be held accountable, I think, to make sure the prescription can lead to success.
At the Health of Young Stands Symposium yesterday, in the discussion session, Rick Monchak from the coast was talking about lumpers and splitters in terms of site preparation, site plan preparation. I agree. I agree with the statement. I think we need to split out the strata that are going to be problematic for your chosen methods, and develop strategies that deal with those risks. Absolutely. If we are actually only planning with one stratum in a 60-hectare cut block, we're going to miss some important details in the various corners that are not represented in the dominant site series, dominant stratum.
Thanks very much. Our next question. I like the suggestion for considering spatially stratified mixtures that more appropriate match microsite conditions rather than established intimate mixtures everywhere. Are there any barriers to doing this other than a simple modification of practices?
I think that's one for you, Ken.
Practical barriers? I don't think so. I am wondering whether there are technical barriers from the direction passed down from the districts in terms of stocking standards. I think though, if there are those technical barriers, then we should be working to eliminate them. The objective is to have multiple species on the landscape. How we allocate those species, which species are appropriate, which are not, those are management decisions that, I mean forest management decisions that shouldn't be directed. I'm just trying to figure out how to say this. Shouldn't be directed from behind the desk or the ivory tower or the boardroom. They need to be directed at the ground. So as an example of where intimate mixtures are good, maybe we want aspen over Douglas-Fir to mitigate the risk of growing season frost. Or maybe we want lodgepole pine over spruce to reduce the impacts of spruce weevil. But for the most part, where we want to establish well-growing plantations, we should probably be growing stratified mixtures so that they are growing in the density that we establish, not a stratified density where we've got low Douglas-Fir in an understory position under lodgepole pine and larch in an overstory position.
Thanks very much, Ken. Next up, stalking standards need to change. What would stalking densities or minimum inter-tree distance would you suggest?
I believe the caribou stalking standards, the enhanced stalking standards in the caribou have gone to 1,800 stems per hectare establishment density. In my own practice, I was thinking about 2,400 stems per hectare establishment density. And that's not all necessarily planted. Obviously, in many situations, you're going to get natural regeneration as well. So, of course, establishing higher densities means higher density juvenile stands and early pole stands. So I think as we move down this direction to have higher densities to counter juvenile risks, we are going to create other risks around snow press, problems of high density stands that will need to be addressed. And so if any of you in the audience heard me yesterday, I'm calling for more thoughtful approach about silviculture throughout the life of the stand, not just ending at free growing. Silviculture is a full rotation activity.
Yeah, I think that to add something that the Stockton standards are changing, and they're a good tool out there to utilize at your disposal when making on-site decisions how to manage that stand. So you have those options out there. What stocking densities or minimum inter-tree spacing or distance would be dependent on the site and what your goals and objectives and challenges are there. So, but as long as you have the tools to and no restrictions from the standards to implement the stocking you need on that site, then it would or potentially result in more effective stand management.
Our next question, should a forest company be permitted to harvest future IDF blocks if current reforestation is not successful at 90% plus? With the sub-comment of motivate licensees to be responsible for silviculture outcomes.
Well, that's a good question. Maybe they should be, but there should be qualifiers on it, perhaps, and how that stand is being managed. If there's a block or a cutting permit that was harvested previously that wasn't successful, and the licensee applies for a cutting permit for the same regime or the same management approach on an adjacent stand, then maybe they shouldn't be allowed. But if they have some other practices and so forth that they're employing to better get better success, then perhaps, but maybe there should be some control in place to assess that.
I'd like to put the emphasis on the second statement, that licensees need to be motivated to be responsible for silvicultural outcomes. And I'm going to steal a little bit from Rick Monchuk's commentary yesterday. The stumpage appraisal system plays a role in this, and I know that's outside the Forest Practice Board's mandate, but the appraisal system essentially drives all activities to minimum cost. So I could turn this question around and lay it at the feet of government, where if you want licensees to behave differently, you have to allow them the resources to accomplish your goals. And so if 90% success in reforestation is a goal of government, then don't drive everybody to the bottom of the barrel in their practices.
I'm going to move us on to what will be our last question for today. The report raises issues of spatially explicit stalking standards. Can you provide clearer information on the spatial level / detail envisioned?
That was a gem that Ken passed on to me during the investigation. So maybe you want to elaborate on that.
Oh, rats. So I think stalking standards need to reflect the silvicultural possibility and the management objectives. So we don't have the same objectives everywhere. An example is in the caribou, we have stalking standards for grassland restoration. So in effect, we're taking the forest cover off of the what we term the grassland benchmarks. Those areas that have been determined in the land use plan should go back to grass. So that is an example of a spatially explicit stalking standard. We also have spatially explicit stalking standards in mule deer winter range in all the regions we examined. And so what I'm driving at is that stalking standards need to be the nexus of management objectives and silvicultural capabilities, possibilities.
Yeah, well, the spatially explicit stalking standards infer to me that they guide you as to on site where to put certain trees and so forth. And current stalking standards give you a range of species that are preferred and acceptable, but do not explicitly say where on those site series and so forth you should utilize them. And I think that comes down to best management practices, but just providing a range of species to plant and then having the prescribing foresters prescribe which species to use where, and we go back to these intimate mixes and so forth on the site and prescribe those species effectively on site. But I think the key thing is to have those species available to you in the standards to be able to prescribe them effectively.
Thanks very much. That concludes the amount of time that we have available today. We covered about a quarter of the questions that we received through Thought Exchange. So I'll remind you that as this concludes today, you will see that exit poll. Please use that last question in that poll if you're interested in hearing more answers to the questions that we received today. If you don't see that exit poll as you leave, there will be a follow-up email within the next week that shares the video of today's webinar as well, and it'll give you that exit survey once again. So if you missed it, you've got lots of chances. Thanks again for joining the Forest Practices Board for reforestation in the dry interior Douglas-Fir subzone. Farewell.
Thank you.
Thank you.